Well, welcome to Book Sandwiched In. And this is our first book review of the season. And I have some copies of our schedule here on the table, so that if you want a copy, if you haven't seen it online, grab a copy before you leave. And I'd like to welcome today Jim Hoyt, who will be reviewing Bringing Nature Home by Douglas W. Tallamy. Jim holds several degrees in natural resources, wildlife science, agricultural education, and science education. He was an agricultural and science teacher in Georgia from 1976 to 2009. He's also a member of the Chemung Valley Audubon Society and a Habitat Gardening in central New York. So without further delay, Jim.
Thank you. Okay. I'm reviewing a book today that was written, or at least published, in 2007. So it's not the latest book, but it's, if you're at all interested in nature, gardening, the natural world, you probably really enjoy it. It's somewhat, Doug Tallamy, the gentleman that wrote it, he's an entomologist with the University of Delaware. And he got interested, I'm not sure as an entomologist, whether he was interested before he actually bought some land. He bought 10 acres of land back, I don't know, in the early 2000s, and built a house on it. And what he discovered after the land got all settled and all, that the plants that started to come up from this bare earth were what he described as non-native plants. They weren't native to this, to the United States. And he was concerned about it because he noticed a lot of leaves and so on the plant. And what he discovered on his land, what got him really interested in doing some research on native plants. And basically this book is, I guess it is bad. It's flashing. So probably a mistake. I could speak up. I mean, I've got a pretty good voice. But this book is kind of a condensed form of his research. And it's sort of like a textbook, but it's written in a way in which it's written in a way in which, you know, it's easy to read. So it's not real difficult. And I kind of broke it down into the chapters that he had. And so starting in chapter 1, he became convinced that after looking at what he had on his land, that gardeners, and by gardeners we mean homeowners, not necessarily people that have a great big huge garden somewhere, but if you have a home and you've got plants around the house, he's talking and addressing, and this book is kind of addressed to you. And he said gardeners can become important players in managing our wildlife just by selecting the plants that they grow. And a big theme in this book is biodiversity. And by keeping that in the back of your mind, being biodiverse, the wildlife and all the people really enjoy will become more evident and more popular. And here's a little garden that I started back in 2016. This is 2023, and as you can see, at least one form of wildlife was attracted to it. There we go. So, moving on. One of the things he noticed was that the plants that grew up in his yard kind of voluntarily seemed to have no damage to them much. And I take these pictures, but I included them to show that example. Here on the left, we have what's known as a Bradford pear. Probably many of you are familiar with that. They're planted all around. A lot of people have them in their yards. You can find them in shopping malls planted. And they, in the spring, before the leaves come out, they're just covered in these beautiful white blooms. And they're there for a week or two before the leaves begin to emerge, the flowers go away, but people really like them. They look really nice. And in fact, the picture of these leaves here could have been made in, say, mid-July sometime. Likely, that's when the picture of this oak leaf on the other side was taken. And you can see that the leaves of the pear are pretty perfect. Nothing much has happened to them. The poor old oak leaf over there, on the other hand, it's been damaged. And a lot of that damage is the result of insects feeding on it. Well, you know what? If insects are not evidently feeding on plants like this, is that having an effect on what's, our environment and the ecosystem that we are a part of? And he realized that, as we probably most all do, that the energy that we have, that all animals have, comes ultimately from the sun. And how this energy gets to us and gets to the other animals, first of all, has to go through plants, because plants are the only form of life that can take the sun's energy, convert it through a process called photosynthesis into sugars that are transferred on up the food chain. And he found that, being an entomologist, no secret there, that the primary consumers of plants are insects. And that on up the food chain, 96% of all birds rely on insects as food for their young. Even birds that don't, as adults, eat insects all that much, they feed insects to their young. And, we're beginning to think about it. If the insects aren't feeding on plants, then they're not going to be there for the birds. And if you look around, this is kind of a typical suburban house. It's a nice house, sitting on a nice lot. We've got a tree here, who knows what kind it is. One tree out there. And you've got these foundation plantings here around close to the house. Well, I don't know what the tree is, but I can guarantee you that probably every one of those foundation plantings is not a native plant. It's a plant that the person owns a house or a contractor that built it, bought those plants from a nursery, and the nurseries today largely deal in plants that aren't native to this area or the United States at all. And in addition to that, to make a suburban lot like that, a large swath of land had to be converted from what was normally there, naturally there. And in our case, before Europeans settled here, what was this area like? It was forests. just pretty much an entire forest that covered the eastern part of the United States. And to build, you know, our homes, and of course, back in the early days, everybody farmed and lived. You had to cut away that forest. And so the cutting of the forest created areas like you see here. Gotta have to laugh because that's part of my yard. You've got areas that don't have a whole lot of trees in them. Well, that had some impacts. When the population was smaller, it wasn't such a big deal. But as the U.S. population grew and more and more land was cut up, you had these little islands of forests here and there, maybe 10 acres here, 20 acres there, but in between you've got, you know, cleared areas that, you know, took away the natural plants that insects and other animals rely on. And so as the population grew, that became more and more serious. And just some statistics, you know, 1900, 60% of the U.S. population lived in rural areas. Nowadays, 2007, I took it from the book, about 300 million people live in urban or sprawling suburban areas. And we'll see a little bit later what that means. 4 million linear miles of public roads have been paved to get us from here to there, as well as 43,480 square miles of blacktop. I mean, all this land was once forest, was once natural land, and now it's been cut up, and the natural contiguous land in there. And then on top of that, like the picture we saw a few slides ago, the suburban lawn. That's what everybody likes. You know, that's what's out there. But a lawn is not a diverse ecosystem, and it contributes little to the energy flow we're going to talk about in just a minute. So 32 to 40 million acres of lawn in this country. He cites statistics where birds, and especially, have been hard hit. Well, they're primarily insect feeders, especially young birds. And as this land got cut up, as their habitat got destroyed, bird numbers went down in a big way. I had some statistics here that I can't remember off the top of my head. Find them. Let's see. Yeah, you know, 50 to 100 million are killed yearly by collisions with cars. 1 billion have been killed by collisions with windows. Birds, especially on migration, will fly into windows and are killed that way. Cats are a big problem with birds. They take untold numbers, and now we got cell towers, and we've got wind turbines that take them out. Combine all that with habitat destruction, and you know, we're 3 billion birds fewer than we were in 1970. He makes this analogy between an ecosystem and an airplane. Well, for a functioning airplane, you've got to have all these parts together, and they're held together by, call them rivets. Rivets and bolts and fasteners hold all the parts of an airplane together. And when they're all held together, you've got a functioning unit that can actually take off and fly and land and do what it's supposed to do. But if, by chance, randomly, you know, every time this thing took off, you know, a rivet or two or a bolt or two fell off it, you know, at first it probably would have no effect. The thing would still fly as intended. But if it happens time after time again, even though it might be 1 or 2 or 3 at a time, eventually something's going to happen. It's not unheard of. As a matter of fact, they have a door fly off and in mid-flight. So even though, fortunately, that particular plane was able to land all right, it probably would have been a different story if a wing had fallen off or an engine had fallen off. Eventually, if fasteners are going to come loose and not be there anymore, the plane's not going to work as function because they're there for a reason. Well, the analogy he makes with an ecosystem. Here's a little, not a very clear picture, but it is a picture of a penstemon plant, a little plant that grows in fields around. It's a native plant. You've got bees, several different species of bees and moths, butterflies, and even hummingbirds will visit the flowers of these plants, and they will, the plant, by visiting the flowers, the plants then will be able to set seed. The seeds will eventually mature and drop from the plant. The seeds on the ground now are eaten by mice and voles and other little critters. There's probably several forms of caterpillars that are feeding on the leaves themselves as the plant is growing. So this one little plant has its place in the ecosystem, and it's supporting several other species. But if something happens to one or two of these bees that pollinate the plant, where they're not there anymore, probably everything will still be okay. But if we get too many bees and moths and butterflies that don't visit the plant anymore because they're not around, then the plant's probably not going to set very many seeds, or at least not as many as it used to. It won't support as big a population of mice and voles in the ground. And then eventually the ecosystem is going to fall apart. Things like hawks and owls and foxes that eat the mice, they're not going to have enough mice. And the ecosystem, in effect, not going to function as well or intended. In all ecosystems, those that study them find that there's usually one or two, maybe more species that are referred to as keystone species. Species that if you take them away, the proportional effect on the ecosystem is greater than, say, many others in the system. You may have heard about the wolves in Yellowstone. Of course, they were extirpated at one point, and when they were extirpated, their natural prey, deer and elk, they were living good because their primary predator was gone. Well, as a result of that, they browsed more heavily. Their numbers grew, for one thing. And then, along streams and rivers, they would browse more heavily than they did when the wolves were there, kind of running around and scaring them. And as a result of that, the vegetation was knocked down more than it was, and that had some effects. Coyotes increased in numbers. Coyotes, although they're similar to wolves, are smaller. They don't eat the same things. They eat things like rabbits and mice and smaller animals such as that. Well, when they were feeding on those, birds like hawks and eagles, they had fewer mice and all to catch. And, the ecosystem was different. This one species was not there. When they reintroduced the wolves, well, now they went back after the elk. The elk were, it's called a fear factor. They were a little bit more nervous now. They didn't stand and browse like they did when there were no wolves. They would eat fewer trees. Of course, their numbers dropped because the wolves were now preying on them. The aspens and other trees that grow along the rivers, they came back, grew back. The coyotes, their numbers went down because the wolves catch coyote if you can. So they went down. The mice and little animals like that, their numbers went up. Well, with the increasing amount of trees along rivers and so on, beavers came back. And beavers create their own ecosystems, and they're largely a keystone species and among themselves. So there you have a whole system of interrelated parts that was disturbed in a big way just because one species, the wolf in this case, was extirpated. So here's a kind of a statement I kind of like. No species is truly redundant because all contribute to an ecosystem's ability to function efficiently. Although we don't know why we need each species of chickadee or spider, we are likely to find out later when it's too late why it's wise to save all the pieces, including those. And, you know, Tallamy goes into explaining a little bit about the pyramid, energy pyramid in ecosystems. You've got the bottom of the pyramid, the widest point, is called the first trophic level. These are primary producers. These are green plants. Without green plants, the energy from the sun can't do any good as far as the living things are concerned. Because green plants are the only form of life that can take the energy from the sun, convert it chemically into, sugars and proteins and different things, different chemicals that animals require. Well, then you've got little critters, rabbits, mice, that feed on the green plants. And they take the energy that the green plants have stored and convert it into their own tissue. And above that, you've got another level of animals that eat the little mice and rabbits and so on. And they're getting energy from them. But of course, as we go from one level to the next, there's some, they're calling heat loss here. There's a loss of energy. Animals move around, they utilize the energy that they have, so as you go up the ladder, so to speak, you have less and less energy available to the animals that occupy that level. And so when you get to the top, they're calling it the fourth trophic level, which is where you've got the larger carnivores primarily. There's less energy available to them, but you need the energy in the first place, starting down there with the green plants. That's where the energy is first taken from the sun and gets going into the living things that are on the earth. If you don't have that, then the whole system doesn't work as it should. We're getting into some science here. And of course, a more diverse ecosystem is an ecosystem that's more stable and is better protected from plants and animals that are not native. Now here, I don't have a slide that really goes into the difference. We need to talk about that though. A native plant or animal is an animal that for millions of years has occupied a certain area. We'll talk about the area here in New York State, for instance. When we say a native plant or a native animal, they've been here through evolutionary time. And the native plants and animals that make up the ecosystems here, during that time, have evolved together. And by having evolved together, they have checks and balances against each other. There are certain creatures that can eat the plants, but not so many of them, but that they'll wipe out an entire species of plant, for instance. There's going to be some check or balance to keep that from happening. And it's taken millions of years for these plants and animals to survive together and create a healthy ecosystem where energy is transferred up the food chain, as we just looked at. But since the European arrival, there's been over 50,000 alien plants and animals that have been colonized in this area. Of course, most of them have been brought here courtesy of people. Alien organisms colonize disturbed areas more readily than diverse ecosystems. So, if an area's been bulldozed, let's say, and bare earth is exposed, and then, we try to cover that up eventually with some plants, chances are that it's going to be colonized by at least some aliens. And maybe not all aliens are bad, but those that seem to like the environment, like the climate, the water's right, the temperature's right. There's nothing eating them because the insects and other animals that would normally eat those plants haven't evolved with them, so they can't get any nutrition out of them. They've got a leg up on the natives. And so they get established and they just, in many cases, go wild. And they propagate and crowd out any native animals, yet at the same time, they're not offering anything to the remaining ecosystem because nothing eats them. Energy that they consume, that they create from the sun, is not being shared with other organisms, and so they're not contributors. We call those invasives because they're not native, they're alien, and they just run rampant in the ecosystem. Okay, enough of that. Here's a good example. Does anybody not know what these things are? It used to be called gypsy moths. They changed the name. And if you've been around this area the last 2 or 3 years, you can't help but know what they are. Right on the left is an egg mass on some bark. And for instance, last year, they were everywhere. And then come May, these little tiny things, when they hatch, they are small. But out of an egg mass like that, you're going to get hundreds of them. And then it doesn't take them long, and they're the size of what you see on the right over there, but they're not native to here. Birds don't like them, those hairy things, and they don't, they're not specific. For instance, they don't, if they only ate one kind of plant, that might be not so bad. No, they eat almost everything. They just happen to have the right chemistry about them to where there's almost nothing they won't eat, and there's almost nothing that eats them. There's no diseases. Well, there is. Unfortunately, that's what's keeping them somewhat in check. If their population gets too high, there's a bacterial disease that will get into them and knock their numbers back. And that's the only thing that's saving us, because this is an oak tree. Look what they do. And in certain places, come June, if there's a bad infestation, the whole hillside will look like winter. Now, how many years can a tree take that? Well, 2, maybe. About the third. If it happens 3 years in a row, most of the trees are going to die because they're not able to send out a whole new set of leaves once the gypsy moths have passed. So there's an example of just one alien. Here are some plants. I'm sure many of you will recognize some of them. maybe not all of them, but burning bush, that's that eucalyptus plant that people plant. It's got one nice feature about it. Leaves turn really red in the fall. That's why people plant them. But they're not native, hardly anyone eats them, and they're invasive. They spread. Japanese honeysuckles, autumn olive, my favorite, multiflora rose. You ever get a patch of that, you'll never forget it. You'll come out looking like you wrestled with a tiger or something. The thorns on those things are unbelievable, and they go like crazy. Barberry, Japanese knotweed. Anybody that doesn't know what that is? It's everywhere. The Bradford pear we talked about, and there's a bunch of others there as well. There is and that's just a few of what's out there. And well, some people say, well, all right, we got these things here now. Let's just let them, let's just let them stay here, and eventually they'll probably begin to contribute to the ecosystem. Insects will start eating them, and they'll be providing some energy, and they'll help make our ecosystem even more diverse. That's a nice idea. Here's a good example: bush honeysuckle. I can't imagine anybody who lives around here hasn't seen these things. They're everywhere. There it is over there in flower in about May. And then this other picture here with the berries. This probably taken in July. Look at the leaves on that thing. Just as nice and pretty as when they first came out, because nothing's eating them. And it takes millions of years for, say, an insect species to evolve with a plant like this, to be able to utilize the chemicals that plant has for defense. It's just not going to happen rapidly, if at all. And so here are these plants. Nothing's eating them, nothing's bothering them. Any place they got a foothold, they'll grow. I have noticed, for instance, in the woods that I have, they don't like shade. So if you can get trees over the top of them and shade them out, they'll usually die back then. But in an area where they're getting plenty of sun, these things just go crazy. And they just, slow pace of adaptation. It's not part of the ecosystem. Everybody's familiar with these. Well, here's a native insect. This is host-specific insect. That means that what it feeds on is very specific. Feeds on milkweeds and their relatives, period. And with our modern agricultural practices, along with other insecticides, a whole host of other problems, the milkweeds are not as abundant as they used to be. And as a result of that, the population of monarchs has dropped off. But you need to have, along with the flowers, now that honeysuckle we had up here a minute ago, plenty of flowers, and I don't doubt that bees and moths and stuff go to that because it's producing nectar. But what it lacks is a food source for the young. You're not going to have a moth or a butterfly, you're going to have a caterpillar first. And the caterpillars have got to feed on something. And they're not going to feed on honeysuckle. And here's just I'm still going to go through all this, but this just shows you that plants, in defense of themselves, produce different kinds of toxins. And these toxins prevent insects from, all manner of insects from eating them. Now, certain insects are going to adapt to a particular toxin, like the caterpillar we just saw, the monarch. The alkaloids and such that are in milkweed, not every insect can eat that. In fact, most insects can't eat it. It's poisonous to them. Poisonous to people, too. But the monarch has evolved a physiologic strategy to digest the milkweed and get energy from it. That doesn't happen overnight. That takes millions of years of coexistence to happen. And this is the kind of thing that we need to promote as people interested in a healthy ecosystem. And this says it all. That little caterpillar in the chickadee's beak, he had to be eating something. And it wasn't honeysuckle. It wasn't some of those other things. It wasn't Japanese knotweed or anything like that. It has to be a native plant that species of insect has grown up with, evolved with. Now, and it's nature herself that defines what's native and what's not. Now, behind all that printing is a really nice tree. It's called the Norway maple. Well, it evolved in Northern Europe. In Northern Europe, the climate is similar to what the climate is here. So Norway maples grow well here. They're a really nice looking tree. They were introduced in North America in 1756. So prior to that, there were no Norway maples here. The growth and reproduction of this tree is little influenced by organisms native to here. That means very little, very few insects feed on it. It's not contributing a whole lot to the ecosystem in any other way. It does produce seeds, maybe a few mice eat them. I mean, there's probably some overlap there. But between 1756 and today, it's been about 268 years. That's not long enough. That's like nothing. That's like 5 seconds ago. And so, it's here. They're somewhat invasive. They'll out in the country, they'll spread. Now, if whoever planted this tree planted a sugar maple instead, they're native. They've got insects that rely on them, and they're a part of our natural ecosystem. Another example, create a little bit different point. If you ever go down south, this time of year especially, you see these. I mean, they're beautiful. They're a Chinese azalea. You can see the flowers are so abundant, they hide the leaves mostly. And they thrive like crazy. You can find abandoned houses where the houses are falling in. Hasn't been anybody living in them for years, but the azaleas that were originally planted there around the house, they're doing wonderfully because they just, the climate's right, everything's right, and they just thrive, but they're not native. And so if you plant one of these that evolved in China, here, there's probably very few insects that can, or any other forms of life that can utilize anything from them because their chemistry is just too different. This other little plant over here, far left showing the flowers are, that's a native azalea to Tennessee. Now, if you were to plant one of those, and Tallamy has planted some of those down, he lives in southern PA, probably more favorable environment than here, this plant will grow. But because of its native origin, even though it's not there, it's not that far from there, they do, not only do they do well, but there are more insects that can utilize them because the chemistry of that plant isn't that much different from the native azaleas and azalea relatives that do live in southern Pennsylvania. So, it's how far away these things evolved. A lot of times it determines whether they're useful at all. The nursery company, industry rather, promotes mostly non-native plants. They've been the biggest sellers, and he's illustrating two causes. First of all, wild populations suffer because, a non-native is not supplying food for the rest of the ecosystem. But then the other thing we haven't really said much about is that plants from other countries often contain harmful diseases and insects. So hitching a ride on one of these natives could be a real devastating critter that nobody intended to get over here, but they're here now. And of course, no matter how hard we try to stop them, some eventually get through. Oops. There we go. The American chestnut. Look at the size of this rascal. Of course, this was probably a virgin tree. Probably was growing here when Europeans settled. Monster tree. There's one over in the field. A really, really nice tree. And it's native, but they're gone. The chestnut blight wiped them out. This disease, let me make sure I get my facts on it. The Japanese chestnuts, a relative, but obviously native to Japan, were brought into the United States in 1876. In 1904, it's about 28 years later, lesions were noticed on American chestnuts in the Bronx Zoo. 50 years later, one of the dominant trees of the eastern forest of the United States were gone. There are no more chestnuts. And this disease is a fungal disease that was brought over in those Japanese chestnuts and wiped an entire species out. This was a keystone species, providing food for countless insect species, and was the #1 producer of nuts, which sustained squirrels, deer, bears, turkeys, passenger pigeons, which we managed to render extinct, doves, blue jays, and mice. Oaks and hickories and beeches have filled the niche somewhat, but it is believed that wildlife densities have never recovered. And now what have we got? Dutch elm disease wiped out all the elm trees. Right now you can see it happening with ash trees. The emerald ash borer is in the process of wiping them out, doing a real good job of it too. Here's a plant. You won't find this in New York because it grows real well, say in Florida. It's really good. I mean, if you lived in Florida, who wouldn't want this plant in your yard? It's called an orange jasmine. It has glossy green leaves. You can see they look really nice. White flowers and small red berries. It's an evergreen shrub that flowers multiple times a year. The flowers are white, bell-shaped, and have a strong orange blossom scent. What a beautiful tree to have in your yard. Well, have you been shopping for citrus lately? When was the last time you saw a full selection of Florida oranges and grapefruit in the grocery store? It's been years, because there's a little insect that is associated with this tree that has wiped out the orange industry, really wiped it out in Florida. I mean, if you go to the grocery store now to buy an orange, it's going to come from California, with rare exception. And so these things, there's just, when non-natives enter the ecosystem, bad things often happen. Alien species promoted by the nursery trade are well protected from insects and diseases. Alien guard specimens often spread by birds through seeds or have windblown seeds. Well, here's a good, this is autumn olive. Nice berries there. Birds love them. Nothing eats the leaves or anything, but birds love the berries, and of course they fly off and deposit them everywhere. So autumn olive is another invasive that you see in any abandoned field. There's going to be autumn olive around here. Tobacco hornworms are caterpillars that eventually pupate into moths. They're native. A little wasp called a braconid lays eggs on the caterpillars, and another small wasp actually parasitizes the braconids. And then here, up here, is a sphinx moth larvae. He's out in the woods somewhere, or in the hedgerow, and he's got these braconid wasp larvae on his back, and of course they're feeding on him, and they kill the caterpillar. But the tomato hornworm might be on your tomato plant in your vegetable garden. And a lot of people get upset with that, and maybe rightfully so, because they'll go through some tomato leaves in a hurry. But there's actually this other little wasp will parasitize these. So that's part of the natural food web there. So if you've got a healthy ecosystem, if you do see a hornworm larva on your tomato plants, you wouldn't need to be that upset about it, because it's going to be, chances are, controlled by the wasp that lays the egg on the caterpillar itself. It's going to kill that thing. And then those wasps aren't going to go real wild in the environment, because these other little things are going to parasitize them. So there you go with that food web idea. And the more diverse the ecosystem is, the more situations like that you have. All right, now we're getting into what we're hoping to gain here. Diverse landscape. Think of all the caterpillars, moths, butterflies, etc. that would be here if you could step into this picture and actually walk among these plants. What are you going to find here? Far fewer. There are 14 million species of insects. Compare that to 11,000 species of birds. 80% of all animal life are insects. Biomass-wise, they're the kings. They're the animal kings of the world. Nothing approaches that. Well, a lot of people don't like them, because there are a few that really, pardon the pun, bug us. They're either, they might sting you, bite you, all that, but 99% are beneficial in ways a lot of ways we don't even understand. They pollinate plants, they recycle nutrients, they prey on other insects that can be bad if they weren't in check, aerate the soil, provide food either directly or indirectly for other animals. Oops. Oh, that's going great. We're getting ahead of myself. There's just a picture of different kinds of insects. Go into that. A lot of people buy butterfly bushes because they want butterflies, and they'll attract them, guarantee it. But no caterpillar species feeds on these things. And they can escape the garden and grow in other places and, push out plants that will support caterpillars, like here's the monarch back again. You got milkweed. Of course, milkweed, not only the monarch's got to have it as caterpillars as well as adults, but here's some spice swallowtails feeding on them as well. So, Here's a pearl crescent butterfly. Now, if you were growing, here's one, the caterpillar of the pearl crescent feeding on an aster. Asters are native plants. And you've got an adult feeding, getting nectar from a coneflower, again, another native plant. There's a, in the place of that could be all grass, just, turf grass, but it's not. Somebody's taking the time to put a little garden in there. Imagine walking through there. And I guarantee if you sat down in the middle of that and everything was quiet, there'd be insects, bees and flies and dragonflies and all kinds of things flying around your head. And then if you looked around on the ground, there'd be little critters crawling up your leg and everything. That's just a diverse, far more diverse than just turf grass lawn. And we're providing food for higher organisms. There's the front lawn. It's been, there's still some grass there, but they, cut back on the grass and put in a little garden. Here's another one. You don't have to go crazy. If you didn't have the time, effort, or whatever, you could put a little plot. Almost anybody could do that. Find some native plants and plant in there. Now here's a yard, and I'm going to mention this again in a minute, but you've got some lower stuff, you've got this tree. Now imagine a bird having a nest up here, wanting to feed its young caterpillars. How far is that bird going to have to fly to probably find a caterpillar down in here somewhere? It's real convenient. Making it happen. How could anybody begin to, encourage more native plants? If you got a dying or a dead plant that was not native, or even if it was, replace it with a native one. Autumn olive, maple leaf viburnum, autumn olive invasive, non-native, maple leaf viburnum is native, but they require a very similar condition. Start small. Don't start something big. This thing was too big for me. This is in 2016. I got this whole area here, and you can see the little plants I just set out. You saw the picture of the turkey in the beginning. It's the same area. It's just this one was first built. And it doesn't take long for wildlife to come in. Sometimes it's maybe not the wildlife you had anticipated, but they'll show up. Build it three-dimensional. And you see this plant here, this is a cranberry viburnum. It's gotten probably twice that size now. But these other smaller plants here, they're coreopsis and other plants that are smaller, and they don't get real big. So if you have it, tiered that way, where possible, leave the leaf. A lot of people want to rake their leaves up, get them off the lawn. It's not necessarily good. Plant native trees where possible. If you go to the nursery and you find a nice tree, I plant an oak tree in my yard. You go in and find a pot this big, it's probably going to cost you $200-300. Well, I'm just spending that. But if you went out, maybe in a little patch of woods, you could find a little seedling. Take you 5 minutes, dig that thing up, set it in the ground, put a little fence around it, protect it, and in a matter of less than 10 years, it's going to be way above your head. Find invasives. Those people are in some multiflora roads. If you've got them, you know they're not, shouldn't be there. You got the tenacity. Begin to take them out. All right, what should you plant? Well, this is kind of an interesting list. Oaks are the top species of plant as far as how many other species they support, over 500. There's a whole list there. I'm not going to and time I see about run out. And well, if you don't know anything about these things, you can go online. This is the Audubon site. Just type in Google native plants Audubon. It's going to bring you right here. Put in your email address, zip code. You'll have a list of plants that you can plant. With the Wild Ones group, they're an organization that promotes planting wild plants. Again, Wild Ones, native plants, going to take you to the website right there. Doug Tallamy himself started this, what he's called a homegrown national park. I didn't even know about this myself the other day. Go in, you put your house on the map, put what you planted. The idea here is to connect people, connect people that are planting plants that are native, trying to make, the space between islands smaller so that native critters can, thrive better. What does bird food look like? Looks like insects. Why insects? You got more protein than beef, a whole lot of fat, water, and the baby birds can just grow. There you go, some examples. Spiders too, they're not insects, but they're close enough. They are important to a lot of birds. And then, the last 3 slides I've got. Humans have disrupted natural habitats in so many places, in so many ways. Our nation's biodiversity is imperiled. The picture says it all. If we continue to plant species that are toxic to insects, the most important herbivores necessary to passing energy from plants to animals up the food chain, at the very least, we will see the loss of many numbers of animals and likely the loss of entire species. That is not biodiverse. We must not let the desire for aesthetics be our primary guide in the selection of plants. They just look pretty, but they're not native. That's not it. The only things that might be native, I don't know what these yellow, they could possibly be, or what these trees could possibly be, I don't know what they are, I can't tell. But most of what you see there, how pretty as they are, not native. And finally, we need not invoke governmental action, purchase large tracts of pristine habitat, or limit ourselves to send money to conservation organizations in the hopes that they will do the right thing, but just begin to select plants that have an evolutionary history here, a native. As gardeners and landowners, we have never been so empowered. If anybody has a question, I'll gladly attempt to answer it.
Are we going to eat insects sometime? Well, they have more protein than do.
Some people do eat insects. I mean, in certain parts of the world, they are a source of food. We're probably missing the boat by not eating them. But I know the yuck factor. Yes.
It seems like you want some sort of a balance. Decorative plants are very beautiful and give us pleasure if they're not native plants. And if you move into a house, there's probably going to be, as you said, non-native plantings there that are insect resistant, and you don't have to worry about, you don't have to keep replacing them. The other side of it is that you want to be able to provide food sources by planting native plants. So is a 50-50 balance something to strive for? Or
50-50 is better than 100-0.
right.
But what a lot of people discover is with native plants that in many cases are just as pretty as the non-natives. But yeah, if you've got, I mean, even Tallamy himself is not saying, you gotta go out there and every non-native you see, yank it up, throw it out. But just be mindful that, you know, if you wanted to plant something, you know, look for something that's a native plant to plant as opposed to one that's not. And a lot of websites will, you know, if you wanted to plant, let's say, with a nice red foliage, one of those eucalyptus that have a nice red leaf in the fall. Well, there are plants that will do it that are native, that be just about like that. You know, maybe not quite as red, but almost. And, you know, look and try to find one that's a native substitute, I guess is what I'm saying.
I think I understand what you're saying about needing to provide food for the rest of the food chain, you know, by having insects. But you don't want to be just providing food for the insects, because then you're eliminating your plantings. How do you
Well, that's what he was.
How do you have a balance there?
The balance, I guess, comes in, the more diverse your garden or the ecosystem is that the plant is in, the more you're going to have the checks and balances that would normally be there anyway. I mean, there's been, down through the millennia, insects have been eating plants. But in an established ecosystem where insects and plants have evolved together over millions of years, you've got checks and balances there. Now maybe, and I understand, if you got in your yard, you may not have the checks and balances in place, and if you plant a native plant, there's an insect in there that likes it, and there's nothing there to offer a check, well, that plant might be in serious trouble. But that's why he's encouraging diversity, not just one kind of plant, but several different kinds of plants in a garden. And then if one plant gets eaten up, well, that was not what I wanted to have happen, but there's other plants there. And you'll find that some plants will do very well, and nothing much happens to them. Their leaves may get chewed on, like the oak leaf we saw early on. The oak trees, those are the plants. I planted some back about 6 years ago. I got them from the soil water people. I got 10 of them, and they were about this tall, down over my head. And you take a look at those leaves, except for the gypsum moths that nearly killed them one year. At the end of the season, those leaves are looking kind of rough. But if you step back where you're not, right up to the leaf itself, you never notice it. And, the trees, they're healthy trees. And, the oaks are feeding all manner of insects. He wrote another book on oak trees that, he goes into great detail about what eats oak trees, the insects that eat them, and what times of year that they do that. But yet oak trees are here, they're everywhere. They're, unfortunately, we've got to keep an eye out. There's another disease called the oak wilt disease that's beginning to, I think, I read that there was some oaks affected in Canandaigua, up that way. If that gets loose, I can't imagine it's bad enough the ashes are going now, but if the oaks go, it's non-discriminatory. No matter what kind of oak it is, it'll kill it. And the oaks are the primary now, or the predominant tree species here. They go, we're in trouble. Yes, ma'am.
Well, an untended, unweeded garden eventually become a native garden.
Well, she said, would a unweeded garden eventually become a native garden?
I
The
don't
answer is-
know. Feel very guilty about the way my gardens look. They're very weedy. They're a mess.
Well, my guess is, in most cases, probably not, and the reason is, the weeds that are in your garden are not native.
Sorry.
I mean, so many of the weeds today that you know, that are out there, you know, planting and I'm not sure about dandelion, but planting for sure, that's the one that, I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, and they're just not native. Most of them aren't, and they just, so, yeah.
I was hoping to make an excuse myself. That's I know.
Oh, I have one.
Oh, pardon, sorry, go ahead.
How come there's more Japanese beetles some years than others?
Well, that's one I could have dwelled on too. Japanese beetles, the reason they thrive any year like they do is that they feed, the larvae feed on grass roots, turf grass roots especially, like a Kentucky bluegrass and that sort of thing. Of course, none of that turf is native, Kentucky bluegrass and all that, fescue and all that. Those are non-native plants. But the Japanese beetle, being a non-native itself, really likes them. So the bigger your lawn, the more you're going to have. I've got a lawn that's too big, and I've got many Japanese beetles. And it's hard to say. I don't know why they might be worse some years than others, but they seem to be bad every year in my house.
Well, thank you very much.